July 5th, 1943, 25,000 feet above the scorched volcanic rock of Sicily. The air inside the B-17 flying fortress is thin, smelling of ozone, unwashed sheepskin, and the bitter copper tang of fear. Outside the plexiglass nose cone, the Mediterranean sky is a perfect blinding azure, but inside the temperature hovers at 30 degrees below zero. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer stands isolated in the nose of the bomber, his hands gloved and freezing, gripping the spade handles of a 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun. Ahead, the sky begins to twinkle, not with stars, but with the sudden, violent flashes of cannon fire. A swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s dives from the sun, closing the distance at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. Warmer looks through his gun sight, a sophisticated piece of computing optics designed to calculate lead and windage. In this chaos, with the vibration rattling his teeth and the G-forces tearing at the airframe, the delicate mechanism is nothing but an obstruction. It cannot track the speed of death hurtling toward him. In a split second that defies military protocol, he looks past the broken technology, trusting only his eyes and the rhythmic shudder of the gun, unaware that he is about to fly into a storm that will rewrite the textbooks on aerial gunnery. By the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces were fully committed to a strategic gamble that was costing blood at an industrial scale. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the theory championed by generals like Ira Eaker and Hap Arnold, was seductive in its simplicity. They believed that heavy bombers, flying in tight formations and bristling with defensive weaponry, could fight their way deep into enemy territory without fighter escorts, destroy specific industrial targets with surgical accuracy, and return home. They called the B-17 the Flying Fortress, not as a propaganda flourish, but as a literal description of its intended capability. It was designed to be a self-contained battleship of the sky, immune to the predation of single-engine fighters. On paper, the logic held. A standard combat box formation of 18 B-17s could theoretically bring over 250 caliber heavy machine guns to bear against any attacker. These were not light armaments. The Browning M2 Mardeuse fired rounds large enough to tear an engine block off a fighter or sever a wing spar with a single solid hit. The air staff calculated that the overlapping fields of fire would create a zone of death so dense that no Luftwaffe pilot could survive flying through it. However, the reality of the air war over the Mediterranean and Europe in mid-1943 was effectively dismantling this theory, one bomber at a time. The Luftwaffe had not remained static. German pilots, seasoned by years of combat on the Eastern Front and the Channel, had quickly realized that attacking a B-17 from the rear, the traditional angle of pursuit, was suicide. The tail gunner, the ball turret, and the waist gunners created a wall of lead that made stern attacks prohibitively expensive. In response, the German fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwaders, evolved. They began testing the bomber's frontal defenses, realizing that the nose of the B-17 was its most vulnerable point, protected only by a cheek gun or a flexible nose gun, often manned by the bombardier or navigator, men whose primary jobs were not gunnery. This tactical shift changed the physics of the engagement entirely. In a tail chase, the closing speed between a fighter and a bomber might be a manageable 100 miles per hour. In a head-on attack, known as the 12 o'clock high, the combined closure rate exceeded 600 miles per hour. For the men inside the bomber, the enemy was no longer a plane. It was a blinking gray shape that materialized from the ether, grew to the size of a barn in 3 seconds, and unleashed a storm of 20-minute cannon shells before vanishing. To counter this, the Army Air Forces relied heavily on technology. They believed the solution to hitting a fast-moving target lay in advanced optics and computing sights. The standard issue equipment for turret gunners and some flexible gun positions included the Sperry Computing Sight. This was a marvel of 1940s engineering, a complex arrangement of gyroscopes and mirrors designed to calculate deflection. The precise distance a gunner needed to aim ahead of a moving target to ensure the bullets and the enemy plane arrived at the same point in space simultaneously. The gunner was expected to frame the enemy fighter within a reticle, input the target's wingspan and estimated speed, and let the sight move the reticle to the correct aim point. In a classroom in Texas or Nevada, it worked beautifully. It turned gunnery into a mathematical procedure, stripping away the need for raw instinct. But at 25,000 feet in the freezing thin air above Sicily, the classroom theories evaporated. The crews flying out of North Africa in July 1943 were living a dual existence of heat and cold. On the ground in Tunisia and Libya, they baked in desert temperatures, battling dust that clogged engines and sand that jammed machine guns. Once airborne, they ascended into a sub-zero environment where exposed skin froze to metal instantly. The physical toll was immense. Gunners stood for hours in unpressurized fuselages, breathing pure oxygen through rubber masks, scanned the blinding blue void for hours on end. Their nerves stretched to the breaking point. When the Luftwaffe did appear, the engagement was often over before the human brain could fully process the geometry of the attack. The young men manning the guns, often teenagers or barely into their 20s, found that their advanced computing sights were sluggish, demanding a steady tracking hand that was impossible to maintain when the aircraft was bucking from flak bursts and turbulence. The technology demanded precision and calm. The war offered only chaos and vibration. The disconnect between the engineered solution and the brutal reality of combat was widening, and it was into this gap that Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer and the crew of the 99th Bomb Group were about to fly. The mission orders for July 5th, 1943 did not promise an easy day. The target was Gerbini, a sprawling complex of satellite airfields on the plain of Catania, Sicily. In the grand chessboard of the Mediterranean theatre, Gerbini was the queen. It served as the primary nest for the Luftwaffe's fighter strength in the region, a forward base that allowed German interceptors to strike Allied shipping and bomber streams with impunity. To prepare for the upcoming invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, scheduled for just 5 days later, Gerbini had to be neutralized. The Allied command knew that if the Luftwaffe could launch sorties from Catania on D-Day, the invasion beaches would become a slaughterhouse. But striking Gerbini meant kicking a hornet's nest. The airfields were defended by some of the most experienced fighter wings in the Luftwaffe's inventory. Jagdgeschwader 53, known as the Ace of Spades, and Jagdgeschwader 77, the Ace of Hearts. These were not green cadets. They were hard-bitten veterans who had flown hundreds of combat missions. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6, the latest iteration of Willy Messerschmitt's Predator. By 1943, the Gustav model had been upgunned specifically to kill heavy bombers. It carried a 20mm cannon, firing through the propeller hub, and two 13mm heavy machine guns in the cowl. Some were even fitted with underwing cannon pods, sacrificing maneuverability for raw destructive power. The Americans were sending the 99th Bombardment Group to do the job. Based in Navarine, Algeria, the 99th was part of the 12th Air Force. They flew the B-17F, a formidable machine, but one that still possessed that fatal flaw in frontal defense. On this morning, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer was assigned to a ship flying in the dangerously exposed Purple Heart Corner, the low element of the formation, often the first targeted by enemy fighters, because it offered the clearest approach. As the formation crossed the coast of Sicily, the German radar network had already painted them. On the ground at Gerbini, the alarm sirens began to wail. Dust clouds erupted from the dry Sicilian dirt as dozens of Bf-109s roared down the runways, climbing hard to intercept. They were not looking to dogfight. They were climbing to position themselves high above the bomber stream, utilizing the sun to blind the American gunners. Inside Warmer's B-17, the intercom chattered with the nervous cadence of the crew. The pilot and co-pilot struggled with the controls as the bomber entered the slipstream of the aircraft ahead. Warmer, in the nose, checked his ammunition belts one last time. The long ribbons of .50 caliber rounds, linked specifically in a sequence of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer, fed into the receiver of his weapon. The stage was set for a collision of two opposing philosophies. On one side, the German pilots, relying on speed, heavy cannons, and the tactical advantage of a head-on merge. On the other, the American gunners, relying on the overlapping fire of their formation and the sophisticated yet fragile technology of their sights. But as the first black specks appeared against the glare of the sun, the theoretical advantages of the B-17 were about to be stripped away, leaving only the man and the machine gun. To understand the sheer improbability of Staff Sergeant Warmer's survival, we must first dismantle the machinery he was fighting with. The Army Air Forces had placed their faith in the superiority of American engineering, specifically in the realm of computing gun sights. The Sperry sight mounted on his .50 caliber Browning was not a simple crosshair. It was an analog computer. It used a system of spinning gyroscopes to sense the rate of turn and the speed of the aircraft, theoretically predicting exactly where a bullet would be 2 seconds after leaving the barrel. In a vacuum, the logic was sound. The gunner would look through the glass optic, bracket the enemy fighter between two illuminated stadia lines, and turn a dial to input the wingspan of the target, 32 feet for a Messerschmitt Bf-109. As the gunner tracked the moving plane, the gyros would physically move the reticle, forcing the gunner to aim ahead of the target, automatically applying the correct lead. It was designed to turn farm boys into sharpshooters through mathematics. But combat is not a vacuum. As the B-17 rattled through the turbulence over Sicily, the delicate gyroscopes inside Warmer's sight were being subjected to violent, unpredictable forces. The vibration of the bomber's 4 Wright Cyclone engines combined with the recoil of the machine gun itself often caused the sensitive gyros to tumble or drift. More critically, the Sperry system was designed for tracking targets moving across the field of view, a deflection shot. It was wholly unsuited for the terrifying geometry of a head-on attack. When a German fighter approached from 12 o'clock high, the relative motion was almost zero. The enemy plane wasn't moving across the glass. It was simply getting larger, expanding from a pinprick to a monster in seconds. The computing sight, confused by the lack of lateral movement and the extreme closure rate, often became a liability. The reticle would lag, or the vibration would blur the optics into a useless smear of light. For a gunner trained to rely on this technology, its failure in the critical moment was not just a mechanical inconvenience, it was a psychological catastrophe. It stripped away the illusion of control. Stripped of his technological advantage, Warmer was reduced to the most primal elements of warfare. his eyes, and his hands. The physical reality of his position in the nose of the B-17 cannot be overstated. He was not sitting in a pressurized cockpit. He was standing on a vibrating aluminum floor, encased in layers of bulky sheepskin flying leathers, wearing heavy gloves that numbed his tactile sense. The air around him was thin and lethally cold, slowing his reaction times and clouding his judgment. He was wrestling a weapon that weighed nearly 65 pounds, fighting against the slipstream of air rushing past the nose of the bomber at 160 miles per hour. The cheek guns on the B-17F were manually traversed. There were no hydraulic motors to help him swing the barrel. Every movement required brute physical exertion. To track a fighter diving at 400 miles per hour, Warmer had to heave the heavy gun against the windblast, all while maintaining a steady stream of fire. Most gunners in this situation would panic. The standard reaction to a head-on attack was to spray and pray, to hold the trigger down and sweep the sky in a desperate attempt to put metal in the air. This was usually ineffective, wasting ammunition and overheating the barrel. But Warmer did not panic. When the sight failed, whether it jammed, shattered, or simply couldn't track fast enough, he made a split-second decision that went against his training. He stopped looking at the sight and started looking past it. He reverted to tracer instinct, using the glowing trails of his own bullets to walk the fire onto the target, transforming the complex ballistic problem into a visual one. He was no longer a technician operating a computer. He was a hunter. To fully appreciate the violence of the coming collision, we must look through the armored glass of the attackers. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 53 and 77 were not fighting with the arrogance of the early war years. They were fighting with the desperation of men defending their own skies. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed a grim respect for the B-17. They called them fliegende Stachelschweine, flying porcupines. They knew that approaching a formation from the rear meant flying into a wall of lead, so dense it could shred a fighter in seconds. For the German pilots, the head-on attack was a solution born of necessity, but it required a terrifying level of discipline. To execute it, a pilot had to position his Messerschmitt 3,000 feet above the bomber stream, invert the aircraft, and pull into a steep, accelerating dive. He was essentially playing a game of chicken with a 30-ton aircraft. Inside the cramped cockpit of the Bf-109 G6, the sensory overload was absolute. The pilot was strapped into a narrow metal tube, vibrating with the power of the Daimler-Benz 605 engine. As he lined up the nose of the B-17 in his Ravy reflector sight, he was racing toward a closing speed of nearly 900 feet per second. At that velocity, the B-17 did not look like a stationary target. It exploded in size, filling the windscreen in the span of 3 heartbeats. The German pilot had a firing window of perhaps 2 seconds. He had to hold his nerve, keep the nose steady, and unleash a burst of 20-millimeter cannon fire at precisely the right moment. If he fired too early, the shells would drop harmlessly short. If he fired too late, he risked colliding with the bomber or being disintegrated by the return fire. The psychological pressure was immense. Every instinct screamed at him to break away, to pull up and avoid the collision. To hold the line required suppressing the survival instinct entirely. The engagement was ultimately a contest of ballistics. The German fighters carried the MG 151-20 cannon, a weapon firing explosive shells. A single hit from one of these rounds could blow a hole in the B-17's fuselage large enough for a man to fall through. They outranged the American .50 calibers, theoretically allowing the Germans to kill from a distance. But the theory failed to account for the sheer volume of fire a determined nose gunner like Warmer could generate. While the German pilot had to aim his entire aircraft to fire, Warmer could traverse his gun independent of the bomber's flight path. He could adjust, track, and spray. The 50 caliber Browning fired a projectile weighing nearly 50 grams at a velocity of 2,900 feet per second. It didn't rely on explosive filler. It relied on kinetic energy. It punched through engine blocks, shattered armored glass, and ignited fuel tanks. As the first wave of Bf-109s rolled over and began their dive toward the 99th Bomb Group, the equation was set. The Germans had the advantage of speed and explosive power. The Americans had the advantage of durability and the desperate, stubborn resolve of gunners who knew they had nowhere to run. The technology on both sides, the radars, the superchargers, the computing sights, had done its job to bring them to this point. Now it was about to be rendered irrelevant. The sky above Gerbeny was clearing. The sun was high, and the first traces were beginning to arc through the cold air. The waiting ends with a flash of light. High above the formation, the leader of the German Staffel dips his wing, signaling the attack. One by one, the Messerschmitts roll onto their backs and dive, transforming from hovering specks into screaming projectiles. They are coming from 12 o'clock high, straight down the throat of the 99th Bomb Group. In the nose of his B-17, Staff Sergeant Warmer braces himself against the bulkhead. The air is suddenly filled with black flak bursts, shaking the bomber like a toy. But Warmer's eyes are locked on the lead fighter. It is a Bf-109 G6, its nose sparking as the pilot triggers his cannons. Warmer grips the handles of his Browning, his thumbs hovering over the butterfly trigger. He tries to bring the Sperry Computing Sight to bear. He peers into the optic, trying to frame the rapidly expanding grey shape of the enemy. But the geometry of the battle is wrong. The closing speed is too high. The gyroscopes inside the sight groan, sluggish and confused by the violent vibration of the nose. The reticle drifts, failing to lock onto the fighter that is now only seconds away from ramming them. In that critical second, the technology fails him. The sight is useless, a dead weight of glass and metal blocking his view of the kill. A 20mm shell explodes just outside the plexiglass, the shockwave rattling the gun mount. Whether by mechanical failure or the sheer violence of the maneuver, the delicate optic is rendered obsolete. Warmer doesn't hesitate. He ignores the dark glass of the sight. He looks over it. He looks directly at the enemy. He squeezes the trigger. The heavy machine gun roars to life, bucking against his shoulder with the force of a jackhammer. A stream of traces erupts from the barrel, burning bright red against the blue sky. Without the sight to constrain him, Warmer is no longer calculating. He is feeling. He watches his traces arc through the freezing air, adjusting his aim instinctively, walking the fire toward the incoming plane. The German pilot, committed to his dive, flies straight into the stream. The 50 caliber rounds smash into the Bf-109's engine cowling. There is a flash of white fire as the fuel tank ignites. The fighter disintegrates, shearing a wing and tumbling past the right side of the bomber, so close that Warmer can see the rivet lines on the enemy fuselage. But there is no time to breathe. The first kill is just the prologue. The sky is full of them. A second fighter dives immediately behind the first, then a third. The noise in the nose is deafening. A chaotic symphony of roaring wind, the thud-thud-thud of the Browning, and the terrifying crack-boom of German cannon shells exploding against the B-17's skin. Warmer is working like a machine. He swings the heavy gun to the left, catching a fighter trying to peel away. He fires a short, controlled burst. The rounds tear through the cockpit canopy. The German plane pitches up violently, stalls, and spins down toward the scorched earth of Sicily. 2 down. Sweat is freezing on his forehead, stinging his eyes. The floor is littered with spent brass casings, rolling and clinking with every lurch of the aircraft. The gun barrel is glowing hot, the heat radiating through his heavy gloves. Most men would be screaming, or praying, or freezing in terror. Warmer is doing none of those things. He is reloading. The attack does not stop. It evolves into a rolling, chaotic brawl that stretches on for minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. The German fighters, realizing the nose gunner is lethal, try to adjust. They shallow their dives. They come in from slight angles, trying to throw off his aim. It doesn't work. Warmer has entered a fugue state of pure reaction. Without the tunnel vision imposed by the optical sight, his peripheral vision is wide open. He spots the flash of a wing over the right engine and swings the gun barrel to meet it. He isn't calculating lead. He is painting with traces. He fires a long burst at a Bf-109 attempting to slash through the formation. The rounds stitch the fighter from tail to nose. The canopy shatters, the pilot slumps, and the aircraft rolls lazily onto its back, falling out of the sky, trailing black smoke. 3. His hands are cramping inside the gloves. The vibration of the gun is shaking his entire skeleton. The nose of the B-17 is filled with the acrid haze of cordite smoke, stinging his throat. Yet, the rhythm continues. Another fighter dives, committed to a suicidal head-on pass. Warmer holds his ground, refusing to flinch as the 20mm shells burst around him. He depresses the triggers and holds them down. The tracers slam into the fighter's wing root. The wing shears off completely. The fuselage spins away like a discarded toy, narrowly missing the B-17's propellers. 4. The crew behind him can barely comprehend what they are hearing. The nose gun is firing almost continuously. Usually, a gunner might claim one probable, maybe a damaged. Warmer is dismantling an entire staffel single-handedly. A 5th fighter attempts a high-speed pass from the low 2 o'clock position. Warmer heaves the gun mount, fighting the G-forces of the bomber's evasive action. He catches the enemy plane at the top of its climb just as it hangs motionless for a split second before stalling. It is a perfect target. A short burst. The fighter explodes in a ball of orange fire. 5. The ammunition belt is running low. The barrel is dangerously hot, potentially warping the rifling, but the Luftwaffe makes one last push. A single Bf-109, perhaps unaware of the carnage that has just occurred, lines up for a final run. Warmer spots him instantly. The broken sight is forgotten. The teenager is now arguably the deadliest man in the Mediterranean sky. He tracks the fighter, leads him by feel, and fires the last remaining rounds in the belt. The bullets strike home. The German plane shudders, smokes, and dives steeply toward the earth, spiraling out of control. 6. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sky is empty. The surviving German fighters, fuel lights flickering and ammunition exhausted, dive away toward the safety of the ground. The roar of the battle is replaced by the steady, droning hum of the Wright Cyclone engines. Warmer releases his grip on the spade handles. His hands are trembling violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He looks down at the floor, ankle deep in spent brass casings. He looks out the plexiglass, now pockmarked with shrapnel scratches, at the peaceful blue horizon. He is alive. The B-17 is full of holes, wind whistling through the gaps in the fuselage, but it is flying. The formation pushes on, leaving the burning wreckage of half a dozen German fighters scattered across the Sicilian countryside below. The adrenaline that had sustained Staff Sergeant Warmer during the 7 minutes of combat evaporated long before the coast of Africa appeared on the horizon. The flight back to Navarine was a grueling test of endurance. The B-17, battered and vibrating from battle damage, limped across the Mediterranean. Inside the nose, the temperature began to climb as they descended, the freezing cold replaced by the stifling, dusty heat of the Algerian desert. When the wheels finally touched the grit of the runway, the crew didn't celebrate. They collapsed. They were physically and mentally spent. But as the engines wound down and the propellers rattled to a halt, the ground crews swarmed the aircraft. They weren't just checking for flak holes. They were looking at the gun barrels. The paint on the cooling jacket of Warmer's nose gun was blistered and peeled, evidence of the ferocious heat generated by the sustained fire. The real battle, however, began in the debriefing hut. Aerial victory claims were subjected to rigorous scrutiny. The Army Air Forces did not hand out kills lightly. They required verification. Intelligence officers sitting at folding tables with typewriters and whiskey listened to the exhausted crews with practiced skepticism. When Warmer reported shooting down not one, not two, but 7 enemy fighters, the room likely went silent. It sounded impossible. An ace was a pilot who shot down 5 planes over a career. Warmer was claiming 7 in a single sortie. But the evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just Warmer's word. The navigator and bombardier, who had been huddled in the nose alongside him, provided corroborating accounts. They had seen the planes fall. Pilots from neighboring aircraft in the formation, who had watched the tracers lash out from Warmer's position, confirmed the destruction. The reports were cross-referenced. The locations of the crashes, the types of enemy aircraft, the timing of the attacks, it all lined up. The final tally was officially recognized. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer was credited with destroying 7 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. In the sterile language of the official citation, it was noted that he remained at his post and continued to fire until the attack was repelled. For his actions that day, Warmer was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States military. He had achieved in minutes what entire fighter squadrons often failed to achieve in weeks. The miracle of Benjamin Warmer's survival resonated far beyond the mess halls of North Africa. It became a data point in a quiet but significant revolution within the Army Air Forces. For years, the doctrine had been obsessed with technological precision, the belief that better optics and complex computers would guarantee air superiority. But reports from the field, like the one filed by the 99th Bomb Group, told a different story. They revealed that in the terror of a head-on merge, a teenage boy shaking with cold and adrenaline could not be expected to perform calculus. Slowly, the training began to shift. The reliance on the temperamental Sperry Computing Sights began to wane in favor of simpler, more robust systems like the optical reflector sight. Gunnery instructors started to emphasize position firing and the art of the tracer stream. They taught recruits to trust their eyes and their instincts, acknowledging that the human brain, under stress, was often faster than the gyroscopes. Warmer's broken sight hadn't been a handicap. It had been a liberation. It forced him to engage the enemy on visceral terms, stripping away the mechanical delay that cost so many other gunners their lives. For the Luftwaffe, the engagement over Gerbini was a microcosm of their impending doom. The loss of 7 fighter planes was statistically negligible to German industry in 1943, which was still churning out thousands of Messerschmitts a month. But the loss of the men inside them was a wound that would not heal. The pilots Warmer shot down were likely not novices. They were members of elite Geschwader, men who had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, only to die over the Mediterranean. Germany could replace the aluminum, but it could not replace the experience. Every time a bomber gunner like Warmer removed a veteran pilot from the board, the overall skill level of the Luftwaffe degraded. By late 1943, the Experten were dying faster than they could be trained, ground down by the sheer volume of fire from the American formations. The flying porcupines were exacting a toll that no air force could sustain indefinitely. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer survived the war. He returned home not as a master of technology, but as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. His story stands as a sharp rebuke to the myth of push-button warfare. We often look back on World War II as a conflict won by industrial might and engineering marvels, by the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse, and the radar set. But at its most granular level, the war was fought by individuals standing in freezing, vibrating metal boxes, facing death with nothing but their reflexes. On that July morning, when the machinery failed and the computers gave up, the outcome didn't depend on the engineers at Sperry or the strategists in Washington. It depended on a single gunner who, in the moment of absolute chaos, stopped trusting the machine and started trusting himself. He proved that even in an age of industrialized slaughter, the most dangerous weapon in the sky was still a steady hand and a determined heart.